Well, tonight's event was supposed to be a debate. And we were supposed to have that debate actually last fall, and we were supposed to have the debate this spring. But Professor Pincus backed out on us twice for professional reasons. I won't say he was scared of you, Bruce, but that's probably what it is. So I said, you know what, let's not try to do the debate again, let's just do a lecture. Now the lecture was supposed to be on the question, did the founders want an activist government? This was the argument of Professor Pincus in a book that he wrote, in which he said that the Declaration of Independence advances what he calls an activist or energetic government. In other words, a government which is active in trying to create prosperity, et cetera, et cetera. Well, he's not here to make that argument, but, as I said, central to that argument is the Declaration of Independence. Tonight, Professor Frohnen will address the significance of the Declaration, more specifically, a part which too few of us pay attention to. And I suspect that he will have some insights into contemporary questions as well. Professor Frohnen is the Ella and Ernest Fisher Chair of Law at Ohio Northern University's School of Law. He's also served as the Charles Evans Hughes Professor of Jurisprudence at Colgate University, the Thomas Bahnsen and Ann Bassett Stanley Professor of Ethics and Integrity at the Virginia Military Institute, and a visiting scholar at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He has authored or co-authored 3 books and edited or co-edited another 8. His articles have appeared in journals including the American Journal of Jurisprudence, the Journal of Law and Politics, the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, and his Encyclopedia of American Conservatism was the subject of a front-page article in the New York Times. He serves on the board of editors or advisory boards for organizations including Clooney Media and the University Bookman. He holds a PhD in government from Cornell University and a Juris Doctorate from Emory University School of Law, and previously served as a legislative aide and speechwriter to a United States Senator and as secretary and director of programs at the Earhart Foundation. Professor Frohnen is also a senior fellow at the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal, which is down the road here in Mecosta, and his most recent book, Constitutional Morality and the Rise of Quasi-Law, written with the late George Carey, was published in 2016 by Harvard University Press. Professor Frohnen is going to speak for about 45 minutes. We'll have Q&A. We'll also have a reception upstairs. Again, if you're interested in Excel credit, the sign-up sheets are out there. With that, please join me in welcoming Professor Bruce Frohnen.
Okay, thank you so much, Glenn, for that introduction. It sounds almost like I wrote it myself. Appreciate y'all coming here. Always appreciative of the Koch Foundation and other people who are willing to pay me to travel. So let's begin, shall we? The Declaration of Independence. Well, what do we all know about the Declaration of Independence? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, don't worry, I won't read the whole thing, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles, and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. If you've heard from the Declaration, these are the words that you've heard. And for relatively good reason. These are stirring words, they're powerful words, words that have inspired millions, words that many people claim have changed the very course of history. These words are the public face of the Declaration of Independence, used to motivate political action and to sum up the principles and ideals Americans hold dear and for which they are willing to fight and die. But what exactly are they? what do they actually mean? We know that these 3 sentences, taken from the second paragraph of a document that goes on for 33 paragraphs, all right? These 110 words out of over 1,300 words. And I read you a lot more than the 35 words, right, that usually are the ones quoted. Right? We know that these words are inspiring, but inspiring to and for what? Of course, most people focus on these specific words. And what we get from these is the claim that we all have certain unalienable rights. What are those? Well, obviously, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I think we all know what life is, though I'm not sure it's being unalienable is all that clear. Liberty at least means not being tossed in jail, except that we all know you can get tossed in jail. And then there's the pursuit of happiness. Sounds nice, but what the heck does it mean? Now, it is of course stirring to talk about self-evident truths that give us important things that we want. It's also useful if someone argues with you to say, hey, it's self-evident, right? That allows you to say that anyone who disagrees with you is denying obvious reality. They're either stupid or dishonest, right? You don't have to argue with them. It's self-evident. But it's not that helpful for figuring out what you're fighting for, and at least as important, what your country should be governing for. The problem is there just isn't enough content in these words, stirring as the rhetoric is. And even though they refer to some things that ought to be pretty obvious, to give us much guidance. Now, none of this is to say that we should reject the language of our Declaration of Independence. None of this is to say that we are not endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, or that those rights are unimportant. But it is to say that these few phrases are not enough to guide us in understanding who we are, or for what we should be willing to fight, as our ancestors fought against those who would rule us without right. These few words are part of what philosopher Michael Oakeshott calls a crib. They're a shorthand, at best a reminder of something deeper, fuller, and more concrete. These few words are not our tradition. They're a set of words that may evoke that tradition, but they don't replace it. They merely point to that tradition. It's up to us, if we're to be free, to dig deeper. Luckily, the American tradition, going back over the ocean to Britain, and over more than 800 years, and further than that in time and place, gives us some useful answers to our questions. Our tradition can tell us a great deal about what these rights are, how far they go, and what role they play within a coherent, living practice of self-government under law. The Declaration, then, is important for many reasons, but originality isn't among them. Even its author, Thomas Jefferson, said that he made no attempt at originality. He was merely trying to sum up the general understanding of the people during his time. That general understanding wasn't a set of philosophical principles. It was a grasp of various institutions, beliefs, and practices, a set of expectations grounded in experience concerning what the government can and cannot do. The Declaration is, in its form and in its content, in both what it argues and how it argues, part of a long tradition of charters, of statements or declarations of the rights and duties of people in relation to their rulers. Now, Russell Kirk made the rather powerful argument that this tradition goes all the way back to the Ten Commandments. Yes, those 10 Commandments, right? You see, the Israelites were just like their neighbors in all kinds of ways. Their customs, their way of life, even much of their form of government, such as it was. But unlike the other peoples of the Middle East, when the time came for the first real set of rules for living together to be declared, they weren't handed down by an emperor who claimed to be the son of a god. No great semi-divine ruler told them, "I give you these laws." Instead, Moses handed down the laws of God. Moses didn't claim to be creating order out of chaos, as all the other lawgivers of this time and this place claimed. He wasn't creating order out of chaos, out of his own will. He was merely serving as the messenger of a higher power. And that meant that these great laws were above the rulers. The Israelites' judges would enforce these rules, but could not change them or reinterpret them as some kind of living document. Think about it, the living 10 Commandments. There was, in fact, a law higher than those judges that they would answer to. Now, we all know about the commandments as a set of thou shalt nots, right? Pretty much what it's all about, the unfun stuff. But what about rights, you may say, right? Well, the 10 Commandments include rights as well as duties, if you look at it properly. In essence, what they give you is the right to lead an ordered existence, to be ruled according to set laws that are aimed at the common good, aimed at setting out the possibility of a life of virtue. That's no small thing. It's no common thing, unfortunately. It's a beautiful and important thing that arguably sits at the heart of the Western tradition. Now, that said, these were early days. Rights and duties of the government were pretty basic for what was, after all, a band of herdsmen. Now, things didn't end there, of course. As societies grew, so did their governments. From judges, the Israelites went to kings, and that brought danger. Americans of our founding generation knew something also about the dangers of kings. Already, they and their ancestors had been living with English kings, after all, for more than 700 years. And during that time, their ancestors had been forced to oppose kings who would rule them arbitrarily, without law, on more than one occasion. Those struggles and the statements of legal rights and duties that came out of them forged a tradition of law, and higher law, law above the rulers. A tradition that the Americans called upon in opposing the tyranny of the English king and eventually in declaring their independence. That tradition, the charter tradition, was a constant reminder to rulers of the inherited rights of the people, of the laws to which even rulers are subject in any decent ordered society. It was a constant reminder and enforcer of the specific rights and duties that had grown up as part of the English way of life and government. We get a lot out of this tradition. But let's begin with those stirring words from the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. Unalienable rights, right? First off, we know that unalienable doesn't mean can never be taken away. People lose their liberty and even their lives, even in free countries. Unalienable does not mean get to keep it no matter what. So it's helpful here to look at a different statement of rights and duties. The first statement we talked about, the 10 Commandments, was handed down by God. There's another one that's important too, that was handed down by a king, though at the point of a sword. When King John lost the battle at Runnymede in 1215, the English barons pretty much told him to sign Magna Carta if he wanted to be king and to continue breathing. A A lot of things were in that document, that great charter as Magna Carta is translated. It laid out the rights of Englishmen and the limits of the king's power. And probably the most important passage reads like this. It's too high up for me to read, so I'll save you from that. No freeman is to be taken or imprisoned, or disseised of his free tenement or of his liberties, or free customs, or outlawed, or exiled, or in any way ruined, nor will we go against such a man, or send against him, save by lawful judgment of his peers, or by the law of the land. Now that language is archaic enough that it may not be clear to you what it means, but it's pretty darn important. It wasn't a declaration of some cosmic set of rights written in the sky, let alone based in our own feelings. It was instead a restatement of English practice, the English way of doing things that King John had violated. According to English practice, the king did not have the power, did not have the right to jail you, seizing your stuff, or killing you, except by the law of the land, a set rule you knew about. The barons claimed quite rightly that they weren't calling for any new rights in the Magna Carta. Instead, they said they were declaring rights that they already had. They just needed to put them in writing and get the king to sign on because he'd been violating them. They also, as would be the case later, had to demand some institutional changes, some changes in government, to see to it that their rights wouldn't be violated in the future. Just like in the end, the Americans had to declare their independence so that they could retain their accustomed way of life. Now, the most important of those rights the barons and later the Americans had to defend was a right to what we today call due process. For about 400 years, we had already understood that law of the land meant due process of law. Sounds like boring lawyer stuff, right? And it may be, unless you're accused of a crime, then it's pretty darn important. Due process means the government has to give you a fair hearing, a trial, before it can toss you in prison, let alone execute you. So, this gives some meat on the bones of unalienable. It gives us something we can grasp and understand and use to defend ourselves. Because unalienable, if we look to our tradition, means something concrete. A process, a set of rules that we know beforehand. It means you get to keep your life, your liberty, and the rights to property and speech that we understand are necessary if we're going to pursue happiness, until and unless you've been convicted of an actual crime in a fair trial. Now, there were more fights, more charters set down after disagreements and violence in merry old England. In particular, the Petition of Right and the English Declaration of Right here summed up the people's inherited rights as barons, as clergymen, as Londoners, as members of communities within the Kingdom of Great Britain. And they limited the powers of the king in ways they deemed necessary and in keeping with their tradition. These charters came about when kings were misbehaving to the extent that the people had to demand some changes to make their rights, their custom way of life, more secure. This was the tradition that the settlers brought with them to America. As they forged their own communities, they entered into their own covenants, like the Mayflower Compact. They also looked to the long practice of inherited rights and duties, laid down in charters like Magna Carta, and also in the charter of the Massachusetts Bay Company. Right? When they founded Massachusetts Bay, they had a charter, a set of their rights and duties from the crown when they settled those colonies. More importantly, they looked to their traditions, to their lived customs and practices as a guide to what they could expect from one another and from their various governments. It was when the British government began violating those customary rights that the troubles began in the American colonies. Many of those rights were explicitly stated in Magna Carta. Others had grown up over the 150 years the colonists have been living and governing themselves in America. All of them had an almost sacred, or at least a higher law, status as the law of the land. And it's to these customs, these rights and duties, that we need to look to understand what I've called the secret Declaration of Independence and why it's important today. Now, I'm sure all of you have heard, and I hope some of you remember, the basic story of the American Revolution. We all remember that picture, at least, right? The British Parliament noticed during the 1760s that they were broke. Okay? The war against the French in North America and around the world had cost them a lot of money. So they decided to get some of it back from those lazy, no-good hayseeds over there in the American colonies. The colonists weren't pleased, of course. But here's the point. They were accustomed to having the British government make money off of them through impositions on their own colonial governments and by regulating the ways that they could trade with other countries. Everything had to go through England. There were all sorts of things that made things expensive for them. But they had never been directly taxed. Okay? They'd always been allowed to rule themselves in most ways and to pay to the British only through their own governments. Okay? Those governments had British governors, but they also had local legislatures who were paid, who paid the salaries of the local judges and controlled them. Right? Americans were self-governing communities within the British Empire. They got to pass and live by their own laws, provided they were not repugnant to the laws of England. And Parliament's new rules would change all that, imposing direct control from faraway London. Worst, even as Parliament rescinded most of its taxes during the 1760s, they declared that they could reimpose them anytime they felt like it. Because after all, we're the sovereign, we can do what we want, and you, the Americans, have no actual rights. You just have gifts from the crown that we can take back when we feel like it. In other words, nothing had the status of higher law. The rights of Englishmen and the customs and traditions that had ruled their lives for decades and centuries meant nothing. Only the will of Parliament ruling through the king really mattered. And to get what they wanted, the British were willing to undermine, violate, and eliminate important rights and customs that Americans have lived by for decades. This is what brought the American Revolution. And this is what the secret declaration is all about. Fully half of the Declaration of Independence is taken up with a list of charges against the king. The colonists did not give the world a few general platitudes and declare independence. Like their ancestors before them, especially in the English Declaration of Right, they leveled specific charges against the government against which they were fighting. They justified their actions, not as living out some grand scheme of philosophical purity, but as a defense of inherited traditional rights in response to repeated violations of inherited traditional duties. Note how the Declaration puts the case. All right? When a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. All right? Only because a long, sustained train of abuses had shown the Americans that they had not merely been wronged, but that the government in England fully intended to strip them permanently of their way of life, did the Americans determine that they had to take action. Only because it seemed that it would never work out did they decide that the action they had to take was to separate, to secede from the empire. In taking that action, they had a duty to explain why, to set out the abuses. And there were a lot of them. Half the document, right? The king has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. And after this charge, you get a set of 5 more charges that go to the same point, that the king was depriving the colonists of self-government, that way of life that they had become accustomed to over 150 years. Refusing to allow laws to go into effect, demanding that colonial legislatures give up their powers, making it impossible for the legislatures to meet in a timely fashion, even demanding completely new subservient legislatures. All these actions were aimed at taking away the long-established tradition of American colonists governing themselves through their own legislatures. Now, there always had been limits to American colonial self-government. That thing about not being repugnant to the laws of England, what we already talked about in terms of the trade agreements, right? That said, the king, actually Parliament, but that's another story, was trying to take away the right to self-government completely. And in the process, leaving Americans without the ability to make even the most necessary laws, all right? And in the list of charges, there's more, much more. The king had endeavored to prevent the population of these states. He'd refused to allow the kinds of immigration that a new people in a vast wilderness needed to thrive. He also has sought to take for himself control over American judges. He had made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. They would now become dependent on the crown, and therefore not neutral judges of events and potential crimes among the Americans. They feared that judges controlled from England would ignore the legal rules and traditions that had grown up in the American colonies, that they would no longer provide due process because they wouldn't even know the law of the local land, the common law of Massachusetts, or even Berkshire County, Massachusetts, because every county had its own customs, right? In the purely military, and so most openly ominous and threatening sphere, the king had sought to take over local militia. He'd sent standing armies to the colonies, and he'd even quartered troops in the houses of the people. Think about this. The British tradition of limited government rested firmly in an armed populace. Unlike the other governments on the continent, the militia had stood up to the king in England in the 17th century and beaten him. They cut off his head. But the point was, English people were much more likely, if they weren't Catholic, to be armed, to have the right to bear arms. Sorry, we're not getting into the Second Amendment. We'll talk about that some other time. But the point is, historically, Americans, the English people had been armed. Standing armies did not have the power to take over the country. Instead, these militia answered only to other persons in their own locality. By taking over these militia, the king would eliminate the ability of the people to defend themselves, leaving them at his mercy and at the mercy of his standing armies, many of the members of which were literally sleeping in the houses, eating at the board, and sleeping in the beds of the colonists, whether they liked it or not. All right? Yes, also taxing without consent, also cutting off trade, no small things. But also the British government had suspended due process of law. Trial by jury had been denied to Americans. Americans were even being transported across the ocean to be tried in military courts for pretended crimes, all in the list of charges. These violations went to the heart of the tradition of ordered liberty under which Americans had been governing themselves for 150 years. There was more. In fact, the list of charges reaches a kind of crescendo as it goes from official actions harming the Americans through law to brute force and suspension of lawful governments. The king had in effect made Parliament a tyrannical ruler over America by assenting to pretended laws from Parliament, taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments. Right? They also had been suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. Taking over all of the governance that the colonists had had for themselves for 150 years. Through all of this, Americans, as the Declaration tells us, had petitioned, had pleaded, and attempted to reason with king, parliament, and people. Still, the king has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us, the final straw. The abuses listed here are specific, and they amount to a claim that the king, not the Americans, had broken the bonds of civil government. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He's at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny. And there's much more soaring rhetoric about a king who's making war upon his own people. Only at this stage, after reminding all who would read this declaration, did the signers declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the crown. That is, it took the abuses to take this duty away from them. And that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. And that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things that independent states may of right do. Notice, again, the claim, because the king has refused to act as our lawful monarch, violating our traditions of self-government and making war on us, we Americans no longer owe him our allegiance, right? Not, look, we can do whatever we want. We have the right to control our own destiny after all. Kings, who needs that? No, not even you violated our abstract natural rights. But you have made war on our way of life. We have tried to work this out, but instead you decided to make war on us. A lawful ruler doesn't do that, and we don't see any way, given the fact that we've tried talking to you, to work this out, to make it so that you won't do this to us anymore, other than seceding from your empire. Right? Only at this stage do we get those stirring final words about supporting this declaration with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. All right? This is the secret declaration. That is the declaration we hardly ever hear about. But the actual substance of the declaration that tells us what these rights are, where they come from, and what it is that they're embedded in, which is a tradition. It was a way of life that was being defended by the colonists. This is the part of the Declaration that lays out the concrete reasons for separating from Britain. In its way, it's just as stirring as a few prefatory lines that most people can quote. This declaration is secret only because people too often argue in vague generalities. We too often make claims that are so general they could be read into whatever we happen to want. They could be based in our own emotions, our own view of what we would like, instead of being rooted in something that we can understand with one another and defend with one another. rather than a set of abstract claims that in fact can empower a tyrannical government. This declaration gives us the basis for understanding the nature of our political community, our civil social order, our rights and duties, and how they form the political part of a free, self-governing society with a limited government under law. Thank you. And I should also add to this, they asked me to put a little slide on here with your, where you can submit your potential questions. I'm happy to take any questions y'all might have. Yes, sir.
Yeah, well, as a historian, I'm actually a bit discouraged because there seems to be today in history this move to kind of throw away the Commonwealth tradition and the classical Republican arguments that have been so well articulated by Russell Kirk, Bernard Bailyn, and others, and to make the argument that the Constitution was basically put together to protect their own self-interest, their economic self-interest, to maintain debts, to even quell the spirit of 1776. I'm thinking specifically of Woody Holton and Gary Nash, some other historians who've made that argument. How is it, so I suppose my question is, how is it that we kind of recover this notion of our founding heritage, and how do we reconcile those two founding moments?
Which two founding moments, I'm sorry?
Well, they might not be in contradiction, but the moment of 1776 and 1787.
On that one, I actually don't think there's a great conflict between the two. What you had first was like an independence. What does the Declaration actually do from a legal point of view? It says we're no longer part of the British Empire. We are, in fact, 13 separate states. Then the Constitution sets out a limited argument for a limited ceding of power from the various colonies to a central government. Okay, so it's not so much in conflict as it is an attempt to set up a new mechanism for dealing with certain common problems. But the more basic question that you're asking, it's an important one, and I think the problem, to be honest with you, is not so much methodological as it is a rejection of the idea that we should have rigorous method. This problem of reading the Declaration has been around for a long time, all right? Part of it stems just from the very power of what I call the public face of the Declaration. It's great as ideology. It's wonderful as rhetoric. It gives us something that we can all get behind. And it was not too long after the country was founded that the Declaration came to have this kind of status. It would be read, and it was almost a religious document. That's a problem that peoples have, especially democratic peoples, where everyone wants to emphasize the fact that none of us is any better than the other. And to a certain extent, that's a good thing. Nonetheless, it lends itself to this idea that since none of us is any better than anybody else, we all should have as much as anybody else. And anything that gets in the way of that must be unjust. And for at least 150 years, there's been a movement in America of varying levels of effectiveness and widespread support. Progressivism is usually the term that we use in talking about it, that's insisted on decoupling rights, this one set of sentences that I talked about, from traditions and customs that make them concrete, that make them so that we can understand them and defend them. Because the great thing about an abstract right is it means whatever you want it to mean. And what's happened in America, as in most of Western civilization, is that rights have gone from the flip side of a duty, a claim on respect and process in going about our lives, into a claim on the state for good things. Right? Protections against things like poverty. Now, this is to say that poverty isn't a bad thing, or that we should not try to do something about it. But now, instead of talking about rights, as these limited customary things that we can talk about. And then work on things like government as a way we try to work out how we approach the common good. We now raise our needs to the level of rights, and we all end up yelling at each other as if policy disagreement means moral turpitude. It's a great problem. It really is rooted in a rejection of history in favor of claims to power. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Oh, Adam, hold on. Give me the mic.
Kind of building off of what you just said, like your answer to the previous question, how do we go about mitigating that, or even like reversing it if we're going in this direction that most Western cultures have already gone and following in their footsteps? How do we stop it, and how do we try and, I suppose, save ourselves?
Yeah, yeah. Well, we're not going to do it by setting out our own abstract set of principles and throwing them out there in the marketplace of ideas and hoping that we win. It took a long time to get to this situation. It's going to take us a long time to get out of it. And part of that has to be grasping some hard truths about what the state can and cannot do for us, about both the limits and the dangers of having the government being responsible for us. The fact that so many government problems have not only failed, but actually made things worse for significant numbers of people who are really in fragile situations to begin with. Once we're willing to talk about the truth, the facts on the ground of what policies actually do, once we start talking about the truth of where our rights came from, then we can have a constructive discussion of what law can do, of what the government can do, and what it can't. And what we have to do together as communities for one another. What that requires, though, first and foremost, is a willingness to engage in civil debate, which, as I understand it, is a purpose of the program that Professor Moots has put together here, and is one of the most important pieces of work that we have, because there's far too little civil debate on university campuses and the law schools in America today. Too much of it is an attempt to indoctrinate into one specific view of where our rights come from and where they go. Anybody else?
Bruce, I'm going to ask, you'd made a comment about counties and judges and traditions. I'm wondering if you can speak a little more to the problem of expecting our traditions to be national or federal, or our rights to be protected, or our policies even to be national, and whether or not it would make more sense to have more things handled at a state and local level rather than a national level.
Sure. If there is a major distinction between an older traditional view and the current progressive view, I think it can be summed up as those who have a more traditional view think that things really come down to character. The choice between virtue and vice, the character, the habits of the people who are involved. Progressives tend to believe in institutions. If we just get the right structure, if we just have the right scheme, just an English term, the British use this all the time. It just means a comprehensive idea, like the Social Security scheme, right? We have the right combination of laws and institutions. Things will turn out all right, right? And there's a big difference in these two viewpoints. One of a traditional mindset understands that no institution can substitute for virtue. Doesn't matter how many paper rules you've got. Unless people recognize that they have a duty to follow them, they mean nothing. Doesn't matter what the law says unless people recognize that it's a virtue to follow them and vicious, wrong, to ignore them. That being the case, if our judges come to believe that it's their job to do justice, to bring the right outcome, no matter what the law happens to say, they've abdicated their fundamental position within our form of government. And once they do that, they're acting as tyrants. Nobody can say no to them. It all becomes a war over who has the most power to control these things. And unless we can count on the law being, in some sense, above us, we all answer to it. We don't get to make of it what we will. We have no common assumptions, no common customs of conduct that can breed mutual respect, that can help us work together. The problem with trying to have policies all at the national level is that it eliminates the possibility for face-to-face dealings. It eliminates the possibility for character to matter in day-to-day relations, right? It's why, for example, a lot of us argue that the problem is not that poor people be provided ways that they will not go hungry and that children will be educated. The problem is when people who happen to be poor are dehumanized by a bureaucratic system that makes them show up and report or be given little cards that they can simply spend as if it's free money, that they're actually being treated as less than human. That is, in fact, much more decent, much more human to have someone at the local level who is in charge of welfare policies at the county level, who knows them face to face, who says, all right, what do we need to do so that you can lead a better life and become self-sufficient? Those kinds of local policies maintain that commonality, that ability to deal with one another as full human beings. And the same goes for law. You know, in the colonial era and well into the 19th century, people didn't talk about the common law of America. In fact, there is no common law of the United States. There isn't one. In a federal court, they have to choose which state's law is going to be applied, right? But it used to be recognized that every county had its own common law, because every county had its own customs. And the purpose of law is not to impose some uniform, abstract, universal rule. It's to, it's a weird phrase, pardon me, vindicate the reasonable expectations of the parties. That is, whether it's a contract dispute or whether it's a crime, the judge's job is to find out, okay, what does a reasonable person understand that term in the contract to mean? Or what is a reasonable person, what would they understand would constitute not defending yourself, but killing somebody you don't like? Those aren't completely different from county to county, but there are some differences from one locality to another. And if the law doesn't recognize that and tries to impose the same exact idea on everybody, it's stripping from us those day-to-day interactions that make life meaningful and allow us to form the kinds of bonds that are necessary to have a decent life together. And it frays. People no longer feel attached to the law because it's not theirs. It's just something the judges impose on them. It eats away at the very foundations of society. How's that for fire and brimstone?
Amen.
You Calvinists.
Other questions?
You all right there? Okay.
Okay.
Well, thanks a lot.
We have reception outside.